you can't really talk about anything before you acknowledge the characters. In that there's like the Stalker is almost like a priest or like this man in general,
a missionary,
and then there's like a writer who is very obviously influenced by Tarkovsky himself, and then there's a scientist, and it's like these three, like this like trifecta of like humanity is like together on this kind of search for.
It's like it struck me, I think about 2/3 into the film, it struck me that the professor was sort of reason and the writer was like emotion.
I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said. Obviously the professor is like this kind of voice of reason and like statistics and science, and then the writer is like very poetic, but it's like they're both going there very selfishly. It's like the scientist wants to go there for a Nobel Prize, and the writer wants to go there because he wants to get inspired to become like a famous writer, because it's like, oh, if you're not acknowledged as a good writer in 100 years, then you might as well just fucking kill yourself.
The Stalker is almost like the vessel of man. It's like this, he has no backstory, you don't even know his name.
Yeah, he's just
you don't know anything about him.
Well, you don't know any of their names. They're referred to as who they represent.
It's really interesting because Tarkovsky, apparently at this time before Stalker, he was like so disillusioned with film that he made a theatre production of Macbeth, and he was like basically was gonna ditch film and go into Macbeth. And I think that Stalker is really not a therapy, but it's sort of Tarkovsky working through what the actual purpose of creating art is.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like the writer in the film, like you said, is almost like an analogue for Tarkovsky, because he's so disillusioned with art and creating art.
Well, there's this whole thing about like the selfishness of man, isn't it? It's like these characters are both incredibly selfish, but they're aware of it, and it's almost like this selfishness is like what's plaguing humanity, and that's why that this like nondescript village that they come from is all like sepia toned and gross, and then when they step into this place that's like untouched by like the selfishness of man, there's like colour and it's like slightly more life.
It's like the first time you even hear like a natural animal in the industrial wastelands that they come from. It's just all of the noises are just like brutal. It's just like brutal machinery. I found this journey that they take through the zone interesting. It's like when you look through the lens that it's the search for faith and purpose, this journey that they take is so humbling. It's like it purely brings them quite literally back down to earth, and you know, their clothes get wrecked, you know, they're stripped of, he's stripped of his gun, of his weapon and defense, and the professor's stripped of his bag and his clothes.
Yeah.
And this whole process is so like grueling and demanding that it like breaks them down. And by the time they reach the room, I loved that they sort of came to the realization that they didn't really want to know. I think over this time where they're just left to ponder about their deepest desire, I think by the time that they're able to ask the question, they realise that they don't even want to know the answer.
Well, yeah. It's like even the Stalker, like, he's never gone into the room himself because he's almost afraid of what it will bring him.
Yeah, and I like that when man is on the verge of discovering the meaning, it all turns inward, and they start infighting and being aggressive and violent towards each other.
Well, don't you think it's great that the writer like defends the scientist, because it's like these like two life-affirming things that is like art and science, because ultimately like what else is there but other than art and science if you're going to really tear life apart?
I think that when taken at face value, art and science seems incredibly contradictory, and there doesn't feel like there's any overlap. They feel like two opposed fighters, and that's how it's sort of presented at the start of the film. They're very, when they're stood at the bar, before they even leave, they're very like at each other's throats about the meaning of the zone.
But it's like by the end of it, it's almost like they're one and the same. It's like art and science are the same thing almost.
Tarkovsky didn't know the bloody purpose of faith. He was just incredibly not disillusioned, but clearly struggling with the idea of faith, and you can tell that Stalker is his way of dealing with it.
Like the role of the artist in this scenario is like, there's that bit where they go through the meat mincer. The writer is like, he's like leading this like expedition at this point, and it's like creativity and artistry and poetry that is ultimately the greatest exploration, more so than science and faith. And without that, the other two wouldn't get as far.
At the end of the day, both the professor and the writer, you know, both science and art, are seeking to answer the same questions. They're both seeking to answer the questions of faith and the questions of purpose in the universe.
The artist's role in, not so much in this film, but just in life in general, is to like be in search of like reason or even faith. It's just like the human condition, if that makes sense. It's like why it's not like what makes things happen, it's like why things happen. If you were to look at science as the answer to what makes things happen, it's like art is like, I don't know, it's like how we experience things. I think it's important to talk about the final scene and the place that Monkey, the Stalker's daughter, has in this film. I think she's referred to as Monkey because she herself is the literal representation of the predecessor of man and humanity. Because fundamentally, from an evolutionary point of view, Monkey is the predecessor of man. So being both monkey and child, she is this symbol of purity and innocence that is ultimately untainted by the selfishness of man and the destructive search for faith. This symbolic power that comes with this detachment from both the selfishness of man and doubt and religion is visualized by her seemingly superhuman ability to move objects with her mind, essentially being her own god that is kind of superior to man. It's like the entire journey, they're kind of like weaving this route that the zone is like seemingly telling them to go, that like is almost parallel to like morality and compared to religion. And it's like there's this line that like you have to follow in order to get to this place of like divinity that supposedly changes. It's like they're like tiptoeing along this line of like respect and like overall godliness to this like place. This feeling doesn't stem from like instinct or reason. Like fundamentally they're not deviating from anything, because this is like interact with religion and morals and like this kind of like moral compass, literally, I guess. For me anyway, it's like the zone was like life and in the room was religion. Well, we both need to watch it again. We're so far out of our depth here, Toby.
Yeah. That's a bloody 5-star film there for the boys.
Yeah, speaking of which, Toby, guess what I watched last night?
What did you watch?
Unfriended.
Yes, I saw your Letterboxd. I missed the Skype sounds. I loved that.
I do miss the
I love
Skype
that.
sound.
I missed the Skype sounds.
I do.